Please welcome to the stage Vikrum Aiyer from the Obama White House and Rose Stuckey Kirk of Verizon Communications.
Hello, everybody. We're going to start with some startling statistics. The National Center for Education Statistics, that's actually a thing, actually pointed out that starting from September 2020, of every parent or every family that has students under the age of 18, 67% of those students had to move to a distant learning classroom environment as the pandemic surge and went underway. But only 41% of that entire student population had access to a computer or internet connectivity within their own communities. And if you take a look at the FCC, their own statistics will lay out that only about 19 million Americans currently don't have access to the internet, and 1/4 of all rural Americans lack access to the internet. So in light of this notion that we are increasingly reliant on an internet everything world, not just for schooling, but for mental health services during the pandemic, for telehealth services during the pandemic, there seems to be this surging nature of our economy and our everyday reliance from a young person to an elderly individual seeking care requiring the internet, and yet there seems to be this yawning divide. What's going on and how can we overcome this?
Look, I think you have to, first of all, define what the divide is. We tend to think that it's just a matter of there is no connectivity, and yes, in some areas that is true, but it is changing aggressively, and it is changing with a number of different technologies that is delivering it. But I think you also need to understand that there is a divide in terms of application. And the gap that we have in our society is that we treat application of technology as the privilege of those who have income and those who have knowledge and those who have the tools. And if we're going to address the digital divide that we have in our society, we have to address it very broadly with not only how do we build out and deliver that connectivity, which we think about every single day at Verizon, but also how do we ensure that you can apply it to run your small business inside of the education arena, inside of healthcare, inside of the very topic that they just talked about, addressing the issues of food scarcity. Because just because it exists doesn't mean that we have the tools in place to enable its use in a way that rises people out of poverty and that allows for equality in our education system.
And it strikes me that the notion of the internet in the classroom, but the internet just kind of governing all aspects of day-to-day life, really does require us to not only upgrade our infrastructure from a public sector perspective, but certainly, as the Chief Corporate Social Responsibility Officer for Verizon, from the private sector perspective too. And I want to put a fine point on that because within the last year, the Biden administration has deployed a ton of cash, notably from the infrastructure plan, around, I think, $64 billion to make sure that they're making infrastructure upgrades for internet connectivity throughout the country, in the classroom and beyond. But to operationalize that and to see the benefits of it from a skills-based understanding to actually making sure that things are online and people are able to tap into the internet takes a whole host of characters and a whole ecosystem. Can you walk us through a little bit about how you see that from your vantage point?
Yeah, well, first of all, the short answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
It is absolutely going to require those type of public-private partnerships. And I think there's a couple of things from my perspective is over 10 years ago, we began to recognize the need to invest inside of our education system in some of the most compromised school districts in America. And those are school districts where greater than 75% of the young people qualify for free and reduced lunch. Those are school districts that too many of us drive by as we take our kids to better schools or to private schools. Those are school districts where the students did not have access to technology and the teachers did not have the application to understand how to apply it. So what we did was to adopt those schools, and we started with middle schools. We now have over 511 in every single state in this country, and in some school districts, 100% of those schools are what we would call Verizon Innovative Learning Schools. And we adopted those schools to provide free technology, free connectivity, and access to curriculum and learning that's available 24/7. So we reached over 1 million students. The reason we did that, and we've done it for 10 years, was because we realized that we can't just talk about this problem. We have to be tangible and on the ground and deliver that solution. But we have to look at for-profit institutions to run alongside of us to make sure that the content is in play. So with our HQ portal, there is content that is available throughout the nation, and frankly, you can access it globally, that tells you exactly how to apply technology into every single classroom and every single subject matter, no matter what type of technology you have. And then we ask partners like McGraw-Hill to rethink their go-to-market models, to partner with us so that they are developing and delivering content that can be used, that is as innovative with AI, et cetera, as available, so that we can change the landscape of education.
So it sounds like there's a couple of different pieces here when we talk about a digital divide. First, there's resourcing actual access to broadband infrastructure, kind of bare bones mechanics of the ballgame. Then there's the actual technology inside the classroom. But there's this increasing framework around digital equity.
Yes.
And I think much of the nation has been grappling with the concept of equity in a lot of different frontiers of the workplace, of school districts, of civil society in their day-to-day lives. But specifically when it comes to technology, what are we talking about when we talk about equity? Is it just making sure that underserved communities get access to the same tech as the Upper East Side, or are we talking about something else?
Well, we're talking about everything that we said earlier, right? It's not only access, but it's affordability, right? Just because it's there, if you can't afford it, what are you supposed to do with it? So we have to make sure that it's affordable, and then we have to also make sure that you can indeed apply it to everything that we talked about before. And let's be clear that if we stick with education for a second, equity for our teachers means that we have to train them on how to be effective in what they deliver inside of that classroom. What does it mean to think broadly about policy issues that are being made in this country that is going to actually have an impact on how you educate a student? If we're going to be a country, and you can debate climate change all day, but if we're going to be a country that says we're going to require certain states to actually have or offer, vehicles, right, that are no longer running on gas, then how you began, and you and I talked about this recently, how you began to think about the technology that is going to develop those, electric vehicles, that is going to allow for scalability, that is going to have a broader impact in society, you got to teach that in schools. And so we can't ignore the connections between policies that are made, the role of technology, and what happens in the education arena, what happens for small businesses who are trying to develop solutions, what happens to our communities when we are a well-formed, well-engaged community that has technology at its core in order to lift the economic experience for everyone. When we do that and we get that right, then we can talk about equity.
Yeah, that's very well said, and actually reminds me of a couple of frontiers in which skills are this required skills for work and the required skills for schooling all seem to be changing within our eyes. It was just a few years ago that on the Concordia main stage that there was a discussion around the future of work, around how do we create a benefit system when we're talking about an increasingly fragmented workplace or an automated workplace. Now more recently we're talking about how do we make sure that workers are equipped for the types of jobs in an online, remote, everything environment. There's obviously new, as you mentioned, with a fleet of electric vehicles maybe increasingly sweeping the nation, or new forms of technology that require new skills on the job, upskilling, apprenticeship programs, ways businesses plug into that technology, all demand a new way of just understanding, how do I use this tech? It's not just do I have access to the tech, but it's the entire literacy behind that. Can you talk through how Verizon shows up in that conversation and what you think about the workforce side of that equation?
Yeah, thank you for that. In several ways. I mean, we think about the promises of 5G, we deliver those promises of 5G. And I like to use a very simple example to make it real for people. When we talk about the benefits of 5G, we talk about low latency. I always tell people, think about two things. Think about your senior person in your life, whether it's your parent, your grandparent, that may have a home health care aide that actually is going to their home, that's working with them, that's making sure that they're getting their medicine. Think about a world of 5G where the robot does all of that. That might be convenient for you to be able to engage with that person, make sure they're taking their medicine, et cetera. But there is an individual on the end of that may not have a job. Think about what's happening when all of us order our Amazon packages and there is a human that is picking for us and getting us, our Tide detergent or whatever it is. Think about a space when 5G enables that warehouse to be so automated that the human goes away. Well, we've got to think about, and every day at Verizon we do, how do we upskill and reskill you so that you can then have the skills that are appropriate inside of this new digital economy? And so we launched a program that's designed to do that and ensure that by 2030, at least 500,000 people are upskilled for digital skills. And we didn't just launch a target and a program, we actually at Verizon are hiring those very individuals into our IT departments, into our company that we are actually reskilling, and then working with our entire supply chain to do the same. So we think about the promises of the technology that we are putting into marketplace, the human impact that it's going to have, and then we build the programs and the solutions and make the financial commitment to ensure that we don't leave people stranded. And I think all of us have to think about that entire ecosystem and what the opportunity is holistically if we're going to have the right impact in society.
That's a fascinating reflection because you're not only developing and investing in R&D for new technologies and new ways to access the telecommunication services of Verizon, but you're also taking an extra step to make sure that the current workforce is able to install that application and the future workforce can loop back in. That entire ecosystem or flywheel, I should say, of upskilling workers within the Verizon pipeline is amazing. But it strikes me that there's a lot of companies in this audience and around the country that maybe don't have the breadth and scale of Verizon's resources. What should the message be for younger founders, Series A, Series B, Series C entrepreneurs that are privately backed, have game-changing AI, machine learning technology, automation technology, and maybe 10, 15 years realize, oh, there might be a downstream implication to workers and wages and benefits, but right now I just have to create a return for my profits, for my investors. Should there be, when we talk about digital equity and digital inclusion, Verizon is doing this in this incredible way and scale. How do we encourage the next generation of entrepreneurs practice the same ethos that you're trumpeting?
Well, I think it's two things. I think private equity firms ought to be asking those questions, right? As they think about who they're investing in and the impact that they're going to have and the fact that they want to scale this company, you've got to think more long term. You've got to have that vision of what is going to happen 5 to 10 years and what do we need to put into place now to enable the inevitability of the unintended consequence. So first, I put it on private equity firms to ask. Secondly, I think that we have to, as a society and as a policymakers, hold ourselves accountable even more to thinking through those issues. Because let's be frank with ourselves. The people who are disproportionately impacted are Black and brown people and women. And so we have an obligation to not just talk about once the impact happens, let's build a solution to care for those individuals. You are never going to lift a society if you don't think about that up front and make sure that you're making the right investments early on so that women and people of color are not marginalized. Our society cannot exist in a marginalization environment. You're always going to have the conflict if you do that.
You know, one of the Concordia Summit's flagship speakers, Dr. Jill Biden, has spent her life and body of work in the education system, the community college system. And when we talk about all the programming required to close the digital divide, we talked about this afternoon, upskilling the workforce to account for the new tech, investments, public and private, to deploy the new tech. But when it comes back to the core question of classrooms and education, let's go back to that pandemic period of time. We saw, since 2020, huge debates flare up around the country between teachers and families in terms of getting their kids back to school. We've seen persistent debates more recently about what we can even teach in school from a book perspective to the language we use to describing LGBTQ history and beyond. It feels that despite all of our politicians and policymakers' attempts to invest in technology in the classroom and celebrate education in the classroom, it still gets politicized, it still gets a little bit of lip service. What would you, Rose, like to see as a true way to center education to close this digital divide?
Wow, you want me to step into that space, huh? Let me just offer this. I think that one of the biggest things that we need to do is think about how do we professionalize, and this is a US-centric conversation, our entire education system. And the example I use is there's not a single company that I know, and I also happen to sit on a corporate board, that actually governs themselves by people who are just angry and mad. They professionalize their board of directors. They professionalize their leadership. What we don't do in this country is professionalize our school boards. The minute that we decide that we care enough about education and we care about the well-educated professional teachers, we need to govern ourselves with school boards that are comprised of professionals so that we can stop debates that are not getting us moving forward as a society, but are stopping us in our tracks because we are making decisions that are emotional and not fact-based, and not for the benefit of how we need to govern our society.
Well,
I'll leave it at that.
And as you can see, it takes a whole of society approach. So Rose Kirk, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.